It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our first of many excellent and dauntingly intelligent speakers. Our first speaker is Sarat Maharaj, a writer, researcher, curator, professor, Renaissance man. He's currently Professor of Visual Arts and Knowledge Systems at Malmö Art Academy in Lund, and is in Malmö Art Academy at Lund University, and has held visiting professorships and fellowships at many institutions, including here at the Jan van Eyck Academy, at Humboldt University in Berlin. His numerous writings, curatorial projects and presentations are well known. Recently, he was co-curator of the exhibition Farewell to Post-Colonialism, Towards a Post-Western Modernity in the Guangzhou Triennale in Guangzhou in 2008, Knowledge Lab at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in 2005, and was also co-curator, sitting beside the director, of the Documenta 11 Castle exhibition to which I just referred in 2002. Sarat lives and works in London and Lund in Sweden, and it's really with great pleasure and honour that I invite him to come to the stage.
Could I manipulate the slides myself?
Just simply back and, or you can give signal to the back.
Oh.
Each time if you raise hands, the choice is yours.
Okay. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, do forgive my rather froggy voice. Friends and members of the audience, I'm delighted to see so many friends, and that it should take Utrecht to bring us to this reunion with my beloved friend Ottone Wiesel. I would like to say thank you to Maria and Charles for inviting me to contribute to this deliberation on the research project, The Former West. It does seem to build up into a rather interesting and engaging body of research and investigation, and though I haven't followed it in detail, I have some glimpses into it through reports from Simon Sheikh. So this is my kind of knowledge of the project. I'm building on the lecture given at the Tate earlier this year around some of the questions that are developed further today. And in the process, I must say that this has become less and less of a keynote and more of a series of scribbles and jottings and notes that have yet to be developed. So I hope that you will take this in the spirit of rather tentative models for thinking rather than absolutely fixed positions on the subject. The three 1989 shows, Magicien de la Terre, The Other Story, the Havana Biennale, line up almost naturally today, but really it's only by accident and chance, rather than by necessity or design, that we have begun to think of them as some sort of conceptual constellation that we would like to unpack. This happens in hindsight. However, there is something that connects and binds all these three events when we look at it in hindsight, that all of them, in one way or the other, were questioning the scenarios of art and culture in the former West. How should we place the art, culture, and creativity of the greater part of the world within that very particular narrow model of Eurocentric thinking with which the former West projected its cultural and artistic credentials? So what we have come to call the former West is in fact a very powerful model of legitimating itself through art and culture, which I do think these three exhibitions, in one way or the other, not in one voice, but in quite different ways, began to question. The Magicien, for example, looked at the range of creativities in order to place them on some common epistemic frame in which they might be examined and seen in some universalizing sort of spirit. The other story looked at the marginals and looked at how this might engage and enter the mainstream. This, at least, was one of the threads of a bewildering number of intentions that go up to make the other story, that we shouldn't entirely unify the project, that it is about also the location of immigrant thinking and creativity in a post-imperial space of Britain. The Havana Biennale saw itself also in terms of the hegemonic West, which had to be questioned. In fact, it very clearly spells out in the diagrams that accompany the exhibition and the catalogue the idea of a hegemonic West and a subaltern, subordinate, post-colonial world. The whole exhibition, in fact, takes place in what it calls the ambiente of the third world, and therefore the world seen, as it were, from quite outside the former West, and yet in every way unpacking and unraveling some of its assumptions about art, culture, and creativity. So other cultures, other creativities seem to unite all of these projects. At the same time, let us not underestimate the degree of prickliness between these projects, that they were not seen to be a harmonious presentation when, in fact, they looked sideways at each other and recognized that they were somehow touching on much the same ground in questioning the conceptual frame of the former West. The Magicien de la Terre, for all its rational lucidity, was also questioned. Was it not some sort of anthropological trap that this exhibition was replaying? And from the English side of the Channel, I suppose we tended to dismiss it as a top-down event, part of a French bureaucratic approach, and of course, Napoleonic. I should say that from the English side of the Channel, the word Napoleonic is not a particularly flattering one. From the French side of the Channel, they tended to see us as the typical Anglo-Saxons in a state of muddle, and of course, overcorrect and totally caught up with PC attitudes. So the political correctness of England, possibly a dig at the United States at the same time, but this was largely the prickliness that accompanied French responses immediately at 1989. With regard to the Havana Biennale, that this was in fact another instance of that bunker mentality that so bedevils the colonial world, and the colonial world in fact caught up with revolutionary socialism. But these are effects that I should like to call part of what I should like to call curatorial capture. Curatorial capture, by this I mean ways of thinking and organizing bodies of art practice, data around art, and, as it were, a series of concepts and conceits through which we begin to develop a way of understanding what a particular project might be up to. Curatorial capture can obviously, as we all know, lead also to curatorial captivity. And between capture and captivity, we have two positions which I think we need to bear in mind with regard to the discussion of these three exhibitions, that the artworks themselves, captured for a particular project, should not end up captive to these particular ways of conceptualizing and organizing what they mean, that the singularity of the creative process, that the creative urges of these particular works always escape the ultimate net of curatorial capture. I've taken this line from André Malraux's work, The Small Change of the Absolute, since Malraux, in many ways, formed that particular drive in thinking about world creativity and world art, looking for this crystalline, universal structure in which he would be able, as it were, to entertain the range of world creation in the drive towards the absolute, by which I suppose he meant something Hegelian, like the unity of subject and object, which is, of course, repeated to some extent in the program notes for Magicien. But basically, I'm using it as a way to signpost in 1989 the general downsizing of all claimants to the universal, the downsizing of universalistic ideologies, creeds, and catechisms. That 1989, from the point of view of the former West, represented the end of totalitarian repression in communist societies of the East. That this repression was not only a distorted view seen from the West of life in the communist world, but actually through the eyes of dissidents in the communist world itself, who struggled for a new type of democracy within the framework of the revolutions that had preceded the formation of these societies. In 1989, those two lovebirds, Reagan and Thatcher, Reagan was supposed to have said to Thatcher, "We have consigned communism to the ash heap of history," of course echoing those famous lines from the Marx Engels texts of the dustbin of history. What had been installed in the face of the totalitarian repressive regimes of the communist world, the former East, was now a form of free market creativity, a kind of capital that was based on constant innovation. This isn't a classical capitalism as we knew it, but the capitalism of the 80s as devised by Mrs. Thatcher and the Reaganites, theorized by economists such as Milton Friedman in the earlier years till he quite fell out with Mrs. Thatcher, and then of course the idea of money and meta-money and making money through non-existent money becomes the basis of the risk capitalism, which was offered, as it were, as a panacea to those societies who had left the devastations of the communist world. What is interesting, however, that by 2009, earlier this year, no more authoritative a figure in the world of economics than the chief editor of the Financial Times should say that we have come to a point today in the crisis of capitalism where we have consigned capitalism to the dustbin of history. It is between 1989 and 2009, between these two dustbins, these two ash heaps. I think the Americans use the word ash can, and of course in England we tend to use the word rubbish bin. And it is this rubbishing of the two systems. It is in the rubbishing of communism and the rubbishing of this particular version of capitalism that emerges with the Thatcherite regime that we need to begin today to examine what 1989 might have signified. And it is perhaps in this image of earlier this year, this is Gordon Brown's dinner table. This is the dinner arrangements for the leaders of the world. And you can see how the former West, G8, has really been consigned to its former status, and this is the present West, G20, and look at the strange gathering of nations, you wonder what on earth is Russia doing there, for example? What on earth is Australia there? How come India has sneaked in somewhere? And then, of course, Czechia, which is an interesting addition for all kinds of odd reasons. Of course, I thought that this lecture might be a kind of script of the conversation that was exchanged over the salt and pepper passing in this dinner. And what exactly was the conversation about? What alternatives faced the world in this rubbishing of communism and capitalism of the version that had prevailed from the 80s? It seemed, of course, in conversation reports and the debates around this in London earlier in the year, that the two celebrated alternatives were examined, that the crisis of capitalism had not exactly seen it into its grave at the moment, but this was, after all, something that we might understand in terms of those cycles of creation and destruction, almost the language of the great destruction cosmologies of Shiva, the great god and as it were male incarnation of Kali, the goddess of destruction, in order to recreate cosmic life from its ruins. But of course the reference here is to the great economist Schumpeter and Schumpeterian ideas of creation, dissolution, destruction, that really these difficult moments of destruction in capitalism that we see today have nothing to do with its entire rubbishing, but is really only that destruction of cosmic life that precedes, as it were, a new cycle of creation. Well, I don't know how much of indigestion that might have caused, but we then moved on to the discussion over Keynes's ideas. And Keynes, too, had a model derived from the world of art. If Schumpeter, in his creation, destruction cycles of economy, which he developed, and it was still quite central in American economics, he developed it further out of his Vienna years into Harvard. Keynes's ideas, which seem to have been thrown in doubt with the crisis, nevertheless did help, I suppose, the conversation along, that in his famous analysis of statistical thinking based on the model of Raphael's judgment of Paris, the idea that statistics, risk-taking in the market, is really no more than the way a beauty contest works. This model of Keynes came in for quite a bit of examination. How could we win the game? How could the beauty contest be won? Not by moving for the particularly pretty and particularly good-looking candidates. You can see how sort of sexist this is in itself, but it is a model taken from the 1930s when we move from the judgment of Paris, this classical assessment of female beauty, to more common and everyday beauty contests. But this too is, as it were, pushed aside. I shan't go through the various economic models that were analyzed and in a way put in brackets, but close with a Chinese observation of the proceedings until fairly recently. The transition of 1989 in the Chinese context marked a higher point of, as it were, the disjunction between the rhetoric of Maoism and the actualities of a capitalist economy coming into play. That this disjunction, which had been carried over for many years, from the 70s in fact, which was called socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now the Chinese, looking upon the intervention of the American government deep into economic life, British and Western leaders organizing the banks, propping them up, saving them, wryly and with some wit, a Chinese commentator says, we are seeing socialism with American characteristics. It is in this scenario that I wish to ask the question, then what would revitalize our thinking? If these two sort of positions are rubbished, where is the source and site of revitalization? And for this, I wanted to use a word, you must forgive me for using these words, but it is a word from James Joyce, where he is, in fact, in Ulysses, trying to examine the various possibilities. What are the alternatives in the world of economics, politics, culture, ethics? How could we re-pristinize? How could we return to a pristine condition, something that has been so soiled, so dirtied, so rubbished? How could we find the moment of re-pristinization? And today, of course, the word is used also in the context of ecological pollutions and ecological dirtying, as it were. And Joyce is writing in a moment not unlike the one that we are speaking in today. The background to his thinking, to the writing of this particular section of Ulysses, where he is pondering re-pristinization, the background to it is, of course, Spengler's The Decline of the West from 1916. And Toynbee, the great historian of England, had by 1915 a work that Joyce had studied and was very much in the air, looked at the cycles of the rise and fall of civilizations, and it is in this rise and fall of the United States, or the rise and fall of capitalism, or as in fact many fairly gleeful commentators, perhaps like Fareed Zakaria, says it's not so much the fall of the West, but the rise of the rest. Or if we look at Jacques' work on a similar thing, we feel there is a rather malicious glee in feeling the future is Chinese. So the re-pristinization is seen either as the rise of the rest, seen as the Chinese, as it were, hegemony over the world, or in fact seen in the terms the shift to a post-Western modernity, the rise of Asia, and therefore the rise of a new kind of economic, cultural, and ethical system. These should not be seen as anti-Western kinds of explorations of where are the sites and scenarios of re-pristinization. But we should also be, as it were, careful that we do not fall into the kind of simplistic trap that the former West fell into in thinking about the transformations that were taking place in the former East. Habermas was to call all the transformations that were taking place in the East, in his writing 1990, as the catch-up revolution. The Nachholländer Revolution, by which he meant that these were societies that had lagged behind the Enlightenment ideals, the ideals of liberal democracy, and that the revolutions in the former East, as it were simply a matter of catching up with the Enlightenment and completing it in the way that the former West had, as it were, endeavored to do. And this, I think, is an important truth, but it is also something that in many ways conceals what the nature of the transformations were of 1989 in the former East, which have such a long and abiding impact that we have yet to come to terms with in the present West. One other site and scenario of re-pristinization is often seen simply as the South, not the former East, not the former West, not the present East, not the present West, but really the Southern Hemisphere itself, that the South-South set of relations is really where the re-pristinization of the world will emerge from. Other connections, other possibilities, and to some extent I must credit this diagram which has developed with my class of researchers over many years, but to an idea really vividly conveyed to us by Okwi, my friend who's sitting here, in his descriptions of the many women who use this particular route in their journeys of trade and activity from in the south, what I call below the visa line of the former West. And below the visa line of the former West, a whole world exists, creative, inventive, innovative, and largely in this instance also propelled by the activity of women, which is something we need to bear in mind as yet another one of the scenarios of repristinization. But is it as easy as that? Can we find not east, not west, but south as a kind of solution to what the world unfolds towards? In the Havana Biennale, one of the most striking elements is the extent to which it seemed to ask, well, what is modernity and what is development? That the question of development, which rises, of course, in the way the former West thought of the former East as underdeveloped, as still catching up, that this underdevelopment seemed to be at the core, in some ways, of the Biennale's thinking. Largely that we are not born underdeveloped, but that underdevelopment is a production of modernity, that modernity produces the underdeveloped zones of Africa and the South in a way that we have only now begun to understand in the phase of globalization as pockets of overdevelopment in the West simultaneously have produced pockets of, as it were, post-development blues across the West. Whole areas, regions have rusted away, industrial life have collapsed in upon themselves, and in fact we find vast tracts of joblessness without any perspective of what the new work creative relations would be in the West in this sort of perspective. Memories of underdevelopment, or su desarrollo, the idea of whether one is a capitalist or a socialist, is at the center of the film Memories of Underdevelopment, which I think is the atmospheric in which the Biennale questions development. In the film itself, by Alea, Sergio and Elena have a very interesting conversation. Sergio, the decadent, bourgeois remnant left over in Cuba, and Elena, the working class woman who represents the future revolutionary, developed, modernist world. And her answer is, you are nothing. You are neither communist nor socialist nor capitalist. You, in fact, are nothing. And his response is to examine the looks of people, to find, in fact, in their body a kind of decay and dissolution which he associates with middle-class bourgeois life. The idea of underdevelopment here is taken straight and directly into the shape of the body, eating, living, and a whole style of being. So we would have, I suppose, to read something like Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa in order to understand this notion of the production of underdevelopment, both in the South and the production increasingly of underdevelopment in the former North, shall we call it, or in the so-called North, or in the former West. In fact, if we look at the Biennale of Havana, what is so interesting is that it looks at such a range of human creativity. It hasn't cornered itself into thinking creativity is only a fine art kind of generic tradition. It looks at crafts, at textiles. The most fantastic collection of textile art and critique of the world through cloth, fabrication and cladding is part of this particular exhibition. And Gerardo Mosquera's most brilliant contribution to this Biennale was a whole collection of wire toys from Africa, long before we could imagine what it would be to be motorized. Here were children constructing out of wire the most fantastical vehicles of transport, and the Biennale featured some of this. And lastly, a report from apartheid South Africa, which is really fairly conventional, a little bit disappointing, but interesting in the spirit of what we mean by development, underdevelopment, emancipation, liberation and freedom, and the coordinates set up for this. It forces upon us, therefore, thinking of the Biennale of Havana, it forces upon us to reconceptualize the classical North-South divide. Which we have to think of, I think, in terms of three elements that I will just simply mention, but not unpack in any detail. That the rise of the knowledge economy would be the most surprising breakdown also of the North-South classical division. It remains the principal contradiction in economic resources and possibilities of life, but nevertheless there are surprises. Almost a cliche now to mention South India. When the economist Galbraith in the 60s traveled through the landscape of South India, he was only able to point out these indolent, inert, inertia-stricken Indians lying about, lazy, incapable of doing anything to help themselves. Famine will drive them to hunger and death. And this was all he could see as his car sped to Chennai airport. Little did he think in few years this will become the hub of a kind of computational knowledge that would be surprising in the context of the South, as it were. Much the same can be said about Chile in the Allende period, but we won't go into that for the moment. But I think if we are to think what is the former West and what did the former East imply, it is a world system that we have to think of, that the shifting productions of underdevelopment and development have to be taken on board if we are to understand how, as it were, things come into being and then lose their moment of creativity and get relegated either to the dustbin or to this rather strange state for which we are using the term former. Formerly, this is the star formerly known as Prince. There's something there that I think we need to examine a little more carefully, because he eventually chose a cipher with which to represent himself in order to refuse a certain kind of representation. And so maybe the state of formerliness is a state in which one is also seeking the refusal of the kind of rigidities of representation that one is encumbered with. And this then brings us to the second element, the knowledge economy, migrations, and the third element in the reconceptualization of the North-South divide would simply be then our understanding of the term entanglement, which, of course, Maria and Charles have already referred to, that we do not see anymore a world of juxtaposed realities, but a highly interdependent, interconnected world. And this set of entanglements is, in fact, something we saw perhaps most articulated in something like Documenta 11, again through the foresight of someone like Ottone, who in my mind first used the term entanglements in its empirical sense, showing us instances of entanglement, as opposed really to the attributions that we must give to this concept of entanglement if we wish to use it, to think it in terms of former East and West, and that would be to the works on modernity by Eisenstadt from Poland, Israel. Or really, as I heard recently, Ulrich Beck at Munich University attributes really the concept of entanglement to Shailini Randeria, who looks at the migrations out of India to the United States and examines not the one-way ticket that we have associated the migrations with in the past, but the round-robin kind of migrations in which the diaspora begins to articulate the former homelands from which one had migrated. So I think there is a further complication in having to think through the concept of formerliness and, as it were, entanglement in our time. Maybe I'll just, this was a page from the Havana Biennale, and I was very charmed to see that in the world of development, modernity, that all these anti-modernisms and so on listed up with quite some severity at the top. And then as these very dramatic lines bring us to the 1980s, we have desarrollisme, which is development, but the aesthetic, the art and culture that accompanies that development is in question marks, which is really very, very interesting. Very open-ended, very uncertain, and that open-ended uncertainness is a certain kind of affirmation of the creative unpredictability of history and the world, which we do not normally associate with, as it were, thinking in the revolutionary, socialist and communist agendas. I wanted to contrast that then with the way the apartheid regime in this image of the apartheid art history room at the University College of South Africa, College for blacks of Indian origin, that in this ethnically segregated university, the art history room was a demonstration of the way in which juxtaposition of cultures worked, that the idea that we place them side by side. I don't really want to analyze this because this has been written up elsewhere, but simply to say that here we have the idea of cultures brought together, but some cultures more equal than others. And it is this more equalness of the separate, discrete elements that overlook the interconnections and translations going on. And it is this that becomes the ground on which we must make a final comparison between the other story, caught up with, of course, the challenge to race and racism. The other story did not, however, theorize otherness in the way in which it would become almost an industrial product 10 years later, that it did not in any way take up the theorization of otherness and difference, but in a very pragmatic and empirical way looked round Britain and said, here we are, subordinate citizens, how do we speak about this sense of subordination? But there were also other threads in it too, simply the desire of colonial artists who felt that at long last they should have a place in the mainstream canon. And so there is a variety of as it were, claims and objectives that are at play. Most of all, can the artist, coming from an immigrant background, coming from a colonial background, from the colonies, can such a person be seen as a contemporary creator, can be seen as someone producing art and thought today, rather than as someone who is simply a bearer and representative vehicle for an ancient or archaic culture from which he or she is supposed to have originated. And to some extent, this was the bone of contention with Magicien, which in many ways seemed to underline the idea that the contemporary artist is simply a bearer of a pre-given cultural ensemble, and that in every way he or she then is not curatorially captured in this, but rendered captive to this kind of interpretation. However, Magicien de la Terre did raise certain questions which I suppose increasingly have to be dealt with, and those might be listed as part of this mercurial, rhapsodic way of thinking of the absolute, of all forms of creativity, as driving us towards some sort of union with the absolute. There is a sense of search for the sacred, for the spiritual, for the numinous, for the experiences of inundation of meaning, in which meaning, as it were, is both so fulfilling that it is at the same time nirvanically erased. None of these, however, go very far. We arrive through Magicien de la Terre and with the other story in debates over multiculturalism, whether it is a highly managed and state and government organized affair, what I have called multicultural managerialism, or whether we have, in fact, today to examine these exhibitions and the trajectories, the intellectual and discursive trajectories in which they were formulated, as having ended up in an even more administered form of multiculturalism, what I call a dirigist multiculturalism, in which the demand for assimilation of all difference, all otherness, all forms of diversity is paramount by the government and state in order to retain some notion of the presentness of the West and the presentness of the borders of Europe. Maybe 9/11 gave a further boost to this. I want to close then by asking the last of my questions: where would we search for the sources and sites of repristinization? And it brings us back to 1989, to Central and Eastern Europe, to the revolutions in Central and Eastern Europe, what we in the jargon call the CEE countries. I've noted already that in 1990, a year after the transformations of the former East, Habermas spoke of the catch-up revolution. The second quality that was associated on the positive side with 1989 was normalization. Normalisierung was the name of an exhibition at the Museum, I suppose, when Charles was there in 2005, which in many ways mulled over this question of moving out of a paranoid, repressive communist everyday life into a more normal kind of a life, which was offered by the former West as a model for normal living. I put these stresses on the terms which I'm sure in the past I would have had to raise one eyebrow to indicate these are ironic terms, are ironically used. I'm not good at that English habit. The normalization as the rule of law, a Bill of Rights, liberal democracy, the autonomy of the individual, these are important gains if we listen to the former Easterners who were involved in dissidence, in the demand for the broadening and enriching of democracy in the worlds in which they lived. They see these as perhaps some of the most signal achievements that come about with the transformation. What, however, is overlooked is the depth of the democratic experiments of dissent in opposing repression that was far wider and far deeper than simply the establishment of these, and I repeat again, very important elements of the rule of law, democratic process, the autonomy of the individual. These democratic experiments took the form of what was called the anti-politics or parallel politics and civic enthusiasm. I'm using terms from different writers from the East, from the former East. Georgi Conrad's famous work, Anti-Politics, spoke then of how could we be political without becoming politicers? How could we be political in our thinking without, as it were, lapsing into the sorts of political corruption that went with politics in the former East and the hollowed out, dried up and desiccated politics that we feel is the state of the former West, that these are democracies of the elite. And that parallel politics, Václav Havel's phrase, where we have power of the powerless in play, is about living in truth. It is about living a virtuous life. It is about resisting, describing that civic association and affinity between people immediately in political terms. It is about delaying the politicization of everyday life. It is about the tremendous value of conscience and of experiencing the pangs of conscience that one goes through, as opposed to the expediency of political life in a repressive regime. These add up to not only an anti-politics, as understood in Georgis Conrad's very fine writings, both in his fictional work and in his theoretical works, but also in Havel's fictional and theoretical essays, that even the distinction that the political need not be antagonistic, that Chantal Mouffe's playing over of the idea carried over from Carl Schmitt, that it can in fact not simply be a matter of friend or foe, but an agonism, as it were, a jousting between positions. Even this is put into a state of delay in the perspective of anti-politics. That agonism, too, is seen as only, on the mental level, the capacity to outsmart your opponent, that it involves opponents and oppositions, that it is about cunning, that it is about outwitting, that it is about, as it were, gaining what you want through the manipulation of persuasion rather than through confrontation, which we seem to feel we associate with the antagonistic model. Chantal Mouffe has called this, in her own writing in the 90s, the return of the political. 10 years later, Terrier, in the French tradition, calls this the return of the civil. So whether we say that the anti-politics, the parallel politics, civic enthusiasm, the desire to create bodies of communion, communication, assembly, affinity, association, which constantly puts in brackets the political and looks for other resources of the human and of citizenship between people, that this space, whether we call it civil or political, does not, I think, matter particularly today. We want to ask the question, where could such a space exist in the world of art and culture? If this is the lesson of the former East to the former West and the present West, then this lesson is about finding those particular spaces, sites, and sources. The great economist of globalization, who has written The Defense of Globalization, Jagdish Bhagavathi, in his work, The Defense of Globalization, says, well, anti-politics of Conrad and Havel are really extremely powerful and extremely important dimensions of understanding what we mean by democracy today. However, he slightly, with great wit, however, slightly puts it down to a kind of Gandhian model of resisting the political. From Gandhi to Martin Luther King, we have a civic enthusiasm which constantly tried, as it were, to keep the political at bay, to refuse the immediate politicization, and to play with the anti-politics, the power of the powerless, and to which I will add Gandhi's phrase, the politics of the unpolitical. Can these actually be be elements that we could take on board today. And Jagdish Bhagawati says, well, noble as these sound, and I think it sounds a little bit superior to say it in this way, noble as this sounds, but it's not got anything to do with hard-nosed politics. But these emerged from the thinking of people who were living in a repressive system and who were questioning it and questioning how democracy could be, as it were, given depth and breadth in very difficult circumstances to which we must, I think, pay heed. Bhagawati's statement then, parodying Reagan, is talk is cheap. Talk about the powerlessness, talk about anti-politics is cheap. It's the policies, stupid. And you know that this is a parody of the Reaganite phrase, the Clinton phrase, that unless you have a hard-nosed agenda of action in a democracy, you really get nowhere. But the question that 1989 asks, is this true? It is a difficult question. It is a difficult question for our democracy. It is a difficult question for Western and present democracy as we experience it, that we need, as it were, to ask. If 1989 is a catch-up revolution, Habermas, with the Enlightenment ideals, if post-Western modernity is an expansion of the Enlightenment ideals, then 1989, the message from the former East, is also the subjective enlightenment that we have so long, for 3 centuries, refused to take on board. The subjective enlightenment centered around civic enthusiasm. 1989, however, is not just the former East as far as we mean the CEE countries, but it is China. 1989 is still going on in China. 1989 is ongoing, for China, in some respects, wants to be the former West. China desires to be the former West and, in fact, to surpass it. But wonderfully, there is also an undercurrent of civic disobedience and of civic enthusiasm. And it is in those acts of disobedience and enthusiasm that we find a resonation today, an echo today of what I call, in the world of art, the any space whatsoever. Where are the any spaces whatsoever, a term which has been attributed to Deleuze, but I'm really have another genealogy for it. We won't go into all of that now. That's an academic seminar. But to mention that the any space whatsoever is represented in many ways by those biennales that we can feel very superior about from the position of the former West. Biennales, the biennalization process is also a banalization process. It's banal. And this irritates a lot who feel that the authority of the former West is lost in many ways by the proliferation of these events across Africa and Asia and South America. But to observe more carefully, these are moments of great civic exuberance, of association and assembly of a kind which is not of the media space, it is not the political space, it is not the sociological space, it is not the bureaucratic space, it is not the academic space, but the espace quelconque, or any space whatsoever, of the art event, of the associations around it, is around the kind of clueless audience that gathers to interpret the work of art, which doesn't look like art anymore. And it is in that engagement, in that trying to make sense of what has not come with a ready-made label of meaning attached to it, in that is, as it were, the kind of space that I see for the subjective enlightenment and the civic enthusiasm messages of 1989 from the former East. I close then by saying that the former East poses this question to the former West. The former West has become the present West, and so it poses the question to the present West, which, as we know, is everywhere. Thank you.